I think all of our jurors and alternates have returned. People is Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present with his lawyers. Our witness, Dr. Fajardo, has resumed the witness stand. And Mr. Balian, you may resume your examination of the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. And the doctor checked me out, and I am still ante-mortem, so. So that's good.
That's good.
So, looking at People's 38, would that wound be consistent or inconsistent with being inflicted by the trigger guard of a gun?
It would be inconsistent with the trigger guard of a gun. Again, being familiar with guns, our trigger guards are very smooth and would not cause an injury like what we see here.
I'm going to show you are you familiar with what a bow saw is?
Yes, I am.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's 39A. Do you see that tool in the floorboard, the back of that vehicle next to the tennis racket?
I do.
All right, is that a bow saw?
Yes, it is.
That picture has a blade cover on the bow saw. I'm going to show you 39B. Okay, do you see the blade on this bow saw?
Yes, I do.
Would the wound on People's 38 be consistent with being inflicted post-mortem by that bow saw, assuming someone was using that bow saw to cut up this body, or a bow saw like that?
Yes.
Let me ask you about actually, I have a pack of 2 photographs. May I mark these as People's 40, Your Honor?
40, 2 photographs, A and B.
Sure. So I'm going to show you People's 40A. Now, is this a close enough picture of those hands to really see any injuries to the hands, or you'd probably like a closer picture, right?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
That's not a tight enough picture to see injuries to those hands, if there are any, right?
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you People's 40B. Okay. If you look on the thumb there, it looks like something healing there on the right thumb of the right hand. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. What, if anything, can you say about that mark there?
It's a healing injury. That's about the extent of what I can say.
Okay. Can you tell from that whether it's a blister versus a scrape versus something else?
I can't, unfortunately. It's healing to the point where I wouldn't be able to make any determination.
All right. So then, could that be consistent with a myriad of different types of mechanisms that cause that injury?
Absolutely.
What types of things that you could imagine could cause that type of injury? Just to give
Again,
a few
any
examples.
kind of abrasion, any scraping of the skin can result in the injury that we see here. Perhaps a blister could cause the injury that we see here.
Okay. Could it be caused by doing yard work?
Surely.
Could it be caught by rubbing your hand the wrong way on a car door?
Possibly.
Could it be caused by hundreds of scenarios that you could probably come up with in daily life?
Exactly, yes.
Could it be caused by a struggle over a gun?
Sure.
Okay. Could it be caused by doing manual labor with a tool that you grip that causes friction on your right thumb?
Sure.
In your profession, do you have cause on occasion to dismember bodies, limbs off of bodies, in part of your training or part of your occupation?
Yes, unfortunately, in those cases in which we can't identify an individual, we would have to remove the femur and send that to the Department of Justice. So we actually would have to take a large portion of that bone for identification purposes.
Okay. And have you had experience in dismembering a head, arms, legs?
No, fortunately.
Okay, but based on your background, training, experience, I take it you've sawed through bone before?
Absolutely.
And I take it you've cut through joints before?
Yes.
Based on your background, training, experience, do you know how difficult it is or easy it is to dismember a human torso?
Yes, I do know, unfortunately, given the work that I do.
Can you describe for the jury what type of labor is involved in that?
Again, it depends on in this particular case that we see, there was actually sawing of the bones, the large bones of the extremities. That's going to take a considerable amount of effort. Bone being very hard, it's not like sawing through a branch. It takes some effort to do that. It's going to take a bit of time to actually dismember a human being.
So if you take a bow saw and cut through like a branch on a tree, are you saying it's bone is more difficult to saw through?
Absolutely. It's much denser and harder.
How much effort would it take to saw through a human leg straight through the bone with a bow saw?
A bit of effort.
When you say bit of effort, what do you mean by that?
It's hard to quantify exactly. It's going to be tougher than sawing through a branch, obviously. A branch, even though it sounds really hard, is much softer than a human bone.
You being a forensic pathologist, let's assume you use power tools in the lab.
We have a special tool, a reciprocating saw that's called a striker saw. It's a name brand. And it's designed to saw through human bone.
And assuming you use your own tools in your lab, how long would it take you to completely dismember a body? Head, arms, legs?
Even with that special tool, it would probably take upwards of an hour to completely dismember the individual as we see in front of us.
Let's assume that you don't have that special tool. You're using whatever's available in your home. You're using bow saws. You're using kitchen knives. You're using, maybe as someone may have described, giant axe. How difficult would it be to dismember a human body?
Much more difficult.
I assume then it would take much more time than an hour.
More likely than not, that is correct.
I assume it would take a lot of physical exertion.
Absolutely.
I assume if you're using a bow saw to cut through a human leg, you're going to be going back and forth many, many, many times with that instrument on that leg.
One would assume that is correct.
And again on the next leg.
Correct.
And again on both arms.
Correct.
And again on the head.
Correct.
And each time that happens, you're going to be causing friction on the parts of your body that are gripping that instrument to saw through the bone.
It's
right?
a possibility, sure.
Okay. In your experience, would that cause blisters?
It could.
And would that be consistent with this injury you saw on People's 40B?
That is a possibility.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Garen, you may cross-examine the witness.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning, sir.
Let me just go directly to the photograph that's on the screen. No, leave it up, please. 40B. On the screen here and for the jurors to see is a photograph taken of Bob's hand, right thumb, And right about in the center of it is a mark that you've been discussing with counsel, right?
Correct.
Now, you know, maybe it's not a local term, but a colloquial term, a blood blister. You know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
The mechanism for getting a blood blister is usually a pinch, isn't it?
It could be.
It's a common thing that might happen to someone that's active. So a kid, a teenager, a grown-up, you get blood blisters.
Certainly.
Okay. And you know a lot about guns, right?
Yes, I do.
And you know the difference between a revolver and a semi-automatic pistol, handgun.
Yes, I do.
Most, if not all, semi-automatic pistols have a method of the receiver going back, ejecting a bullet, and then injecting another bullet into the chamber.
Correct.
Now, are you familiar with the Ruger 22? It's one of the most popular handguns for plinking and target shooting.
The rifle?
No. That's the. There is a Ruger 22 that's made like an M1, or looks like an M1, but then there's a Ruger 22 that looks a lot like a Colt Woodsman.
No, I'm not familiar.
Oh, you're not. All right. But it is true that most semi-automatic handguns, when the bullet is fired, it ejects a shell with the slide going back and then injects another shell.
That is correct.
Now, if you were to catch the web of your thumb between the receiver as it comes back, it could pinch it.
Yes.
Right? And if you pinch your thumb, you could, in that fashion, form a blood blister.
Absolutely.
Intuitively, just common knowledge, blood blisters first form maybe a little red spot, and within a few days, they start to resolve, right?
They can, or they can pop open, unfortunately.
Sure. And if they resolve, it's like a week or 10 days for them to resolve?
About, yes.
Well, look at this one again. That has the appearance of a blood blister that has resolved over several days, maybe as much as a week or 10 days, doesn't it?
It is a possibility, absolutely.
I know that you reviewed the Galveston autopsy report, didn't you?
I did.
And you say that you talked with Dr. White there?
I believe we did. I could be wrong in that recollection. It happened so many years ago.
I'm sorry, I said Dr. White. It was Dr. Harvey, Charles Harvey?
I believe we did.
Okay. And so let me just turn to that since we're on that subject right now. You can take that down, please. Thank you. We saw a photograph of the right hand of Morris Black that was taken during autopsy.
Correct.
That injury appeared to be post-mortem, didn't it?
In my opinion, that is correct.
In fact, I think Charles Harvey didn't use the term post-mortem. He used non-vital, right?
I don't recall, and I don't have the report in front of me.
Do you recall the term or the description of it as sharp incision to dorsal thenar web of right hand, 1 inch to deep subcutaneum, extending slightly palmar, non-vital appearance in immersed tissues?
I do not recall that. I don't have that report in front of me.
Okay. When did you last see that report?
Years ago.
Okay. Well, assuming that that's what the report says, non-vital in appearance in immersed tissues. What does that mean?
Means just like what we discussed. There's no evidence that there's any blood due to the water immersion very commonly seen.
That's the immersed part of it. Non-vital means post-mortem, doesn't it?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so even though, assuming that Dr. Harvey used that term, non-vital, it is the same, synonymous with post-mortem.
Correct. That's what I would interpret those words that he used to mean.
You were asked about dismembering.
Yes.
Is it easier?
No, it is not.
No, I'm not through. Is it easier to cut the ligaments around a joint and thereby dismember, say, an arm or a leg, rather than cut through the bone?
It's a toss-up. I would say yes, from my perspective, because I know where those ligaments are and what ligaments need to be cut. So from my perspective, yeah, it's much easier. For someone who doesn't know those ligaments to cut, it's probably going to be tougher unless they're familiar with human anatomy and know where to cut.
So, seeking to cut through bone, either with a bow saw or an axe, that's a tough way to do it, isn't it?
It is.
I hate to draw the parallel, but a lot of folks have the experience of buying a chicken to eat and then cutting the chicken up and going through the joints, not through the bones.
Exactly.
And so we can kind of draw a parallel there.
Correct.
Right? But if you don't know what you're doing, you might saw through the chicken's drumstick.
Yes.
Or through the chicken's wing bone.
Yes.
And if you don't know what you're doing in cutting up a body, you might seek to use a bow saw or an axe.
Surely.
Okay. I don't know if you know much about the geography of Galveston Bay or the presence of sharp oyster shells on the floor of the bay and so forth, but the cuts that we saw on Morris Black's hands could have been caused by something like that. We're going to object. Correct? Well, who's objecting here? What?
We already said prior, the situation continues. Prior to the pandemic, Your Honor, we had filed and said that I would be handling all objections on witnesses, and I'll be doing that again.
All right, I'll recognize Mr. Lewin and overrule his objection.
Okay, I kind of forgot what the question was.
About oysters.
Oh yeah, about oyster shells and other debris on the floor of, on the seafloor of Galveston Bay. Is it within reasonable? Well, is it reasonable to? Oh, no, what's the terminology? Is it consistent with what you saw that the injuries could have been gotten that way?
I'd have to say I don't know on this particular question. The reason being is I'm not familiar with those oysters in Galveston Bay or the sharks that might be there. I don't know what injuries they could potentially cause in the postmortem state, so I don't know.
Okay. And you talked about how difficult it would be to saw through bone if that was the manner that was used. In your review of the autopsy, did you see that there were several things observed about where the bones were separated?
Yes.
That is, there were saw marks,
Yes.
but there were also chop marks, broken bones.
I do not recall.
Did you view the photographs, the autopsy photographs taken of Morris Black?
Yes, I did.
Did you yourself see the ends of the bones that were separated?
On the photographs, I did.
And did you notice that there were not only saw marks, but there are also jagged portions?
I do not recall.
You're not saying there were not, you just don't recall it.
Correct. Again, it's been a year since I've looked at those photos.
Okay. It was clear from the autopsy of Morris Black that none of the body parts that were found showed any vital injury. Is that right?
Correct.
That is, there was no indication on the torso, the legs, the arms, the hands of an injury that would have caused death.
Correct.
But the head was missing.
Correct.
Now, with the head missing, Dr. Harvey had to make some assumptions, and you would have to make some assumptions following the autopsy, correct?
Correct.
And by the way, for one medical examiner, one forensic pathologist, to review the autopsy report of another forensic pathologist, that's done frequently, isn't it?
Not infrequently, sure.
One problem is, by the time, say, 10 years later, you happen to review it, the body may be well gone, buried, cremated, whatever happened, and you don't get to actually see the body.
Yes, indeed.
You have to rely on the descriptions in the autopsy report to judge on your own basis whether the autopsy report was, number one, complete, right?
Sure.
Number two, accurate, correct?
Sure.
And number three, has enough information for you to arrive at your own independent conclusions.
Well, I don't rely on the actual report itself. I have to rely on the photographs. And let me give you an example. Sometimes there aren't enough photographs taken, and I can't make an independent opinion because the actual autopsy report of the other pathologist is considered hearsay. In other words, it's not something that I can rely upon in making my own opinion.
Well, you did have the photographs as well as the autopsy report
Yes,
and the investigator's report.
correct.
And so you had enough, in your own opinion, to arrive at you had enough, in your view, to arrive at your own opinion. Is that correct?
For Susan Berman, that is correct.
Well, what about for Morris Black?
I was not asked to give a cause of death.
What does the phrase terminal aspiration of blood mean to you?
Abstain.
We'll have Dr. Harvey.
Well, let me put it this way. Did you review Dr. Harvey's findings?
Yes, I did.
Overruled.
Among his findings was evidence of terminal aspiration of blood into tracheobronchial tree and lungs.
That is correct.
You recall that?
Yes,
All
I
right.
do.
Not yet. Overruled.
What does that mean? Evidence of terminal aspiration of blood into tracheobronchial tree and lungs.
Abstain. Abstain.
Dr. Harvey concluded homicide by unknown means.
Objection.
Do you agree?
Which
Beyond
would
scope, hearsay, lack of foundation.
sustain.
Was it significant in Dr. Harvey not arriving at a conclusion to know that the head was not available for him to examine?
Same objections. Dr. Harvey will be a witness through his testimony in this case.
I don't need you to explain.
Yes.
It's beyond the scope. I'll sustain it.
Well, let me ask it this way, and I want to stay within the judge's rulings, but did you rely on the autopsy report and the conclusions of Dr. Harvey in your testimony with Mr. Bailey earlier today?
No, I just relied on the photographs that were presented and the questions that were asked.
But you did review the report, didn't you?
I did.
All right, well, let's go to Susan Berman's autopsy. Again, you did not do this autopsy.
Correct.
And as I understand it, you were not with the LA medical examiner's office at the time of the autopsy, is that right?
Correct.
You came in later and you've reviewed now what the medical examiner who actually, or the forensic pathologist who actually did the autopsy for your
Correct.
testimony.
Correct.
Did you also review and did you also rely on the investigator's report?
Absolutely.
That's common, isn't it?
Yes.
In other words, there are, I don't know how many, but there are investigators that work for the medical examiner's office as opposed to being, say, LA Police Department employees who investigate for the forensic pathologist.
Correct. For the medical examiner office. Correct.
And these folks are trained, right?
Yes.
Experienced.
Absolutely.
They know the difference between livor mortis and rigor mortis and algor mortis.
Absolutely.
And they're trained to be the first ones of any medical expertise to view a homicide victim.
Correct.
They get to the scene very quickly after a homicide is after a body is found, don't they?
As fast as they can here in Los Angeles. That is correct.
So this investigator that did this case was named Craig Knapp, Knapp.
Correct.
Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I am.
Does he still work for you?
No,
How long ago did he leave the office?
I don't recall.
All right. But you consider his work to be acceptable and reliable?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's true, isn't it, that he did not see any livor mortis, livor mortis.
That is correct.
He also did not see rigor mortis.
That is correct.
Now, he saw the body on December the 24th, at 16:10 hours. Oh, no, sorry, 17:30 hours,
Correct.
5:30 p.m.
That is correct.
So he arrived there pretty quickly after the police did.
Fairly quickly, yes.
So we know from his report that at 5:30 p.m. on December the 24th, rigor mortis was not present.
Correct.
Rigor mortis is the stiffening of the body that starts within a couple of hours after death, right?
Correct.
And it proceeds for the body to get so stiff that all the muscles lock up.
That is correct.
But then after a period of time, I believe you said 12, generally speaking, 12 hours,
18 to 36 hours.
18 to 36 hours,
Yes.
then it relaxes.
Correct.
And generally speaking, depending on the environment and how hot or cold it is in the room, it is gone so that it can't be found by how many hours?
Correct.
How many hours?
I'm sorry, how many hours
How many hours before it's gone?
before it's gone? Again, we're talking about it starts to dissipate between 18 and 36 hours. So 18 hours is one of the earliest that it can be gone.
Okay. So we know that from assuming that he was correct, that there was no rigor mortis, Susan Berman must have died at least 18 hours earlier and as much as 36 hours?
And beyond. Remember, once it's gone, it can be beyond that time period. So
Okay.
2 days before, 3 days before.
One thing that determines or is influential on how fast rigor mortis goes away is the temperature of the room in which the body is, right?
Absolutely.
Did you find any place where the police or the investigator took the temperature of the room?
No.
Is it true that another method of determining when the person died is by taking liver, L-I-V-E-R, temperature?
That is a more specific examination of how cold the body has become. Again, we're talking about algor mortis, the cooling of the human body. And there are a bunch of graphs that kind of give an estimation as to how long someone may have been dead. But the reality is it's pretty much not as even as accurate as what we have in hand right now. Again, 18 to 36 hours is the window in which rigor mortis will dissipate.
Right. And the temperature, liver temperature, is a reliable way of determining how long ago someone died, isn't it?
No, sir. In fact, I just said the opposite. It's an unreliable way. Perhaps
Sorry,
a
I missed that.
little bit more accurate than what we have, but not much.
Is it liver temperature affected by the environment? In other words, the heat or cold of a room?
It can be, sure.
And so if you know the heat or the temperature of the room, does that assist you in knowing how reliable the rigor mortis dissipating, or excuse me, how reliable the liver temperature is?
Yes, it can play a role in that, absolutely.
But you don't have that information,
We do not.
and you don't. No one took liver temperature, correct?
That is correct.
And by the time the autopsy was done, Susan Berman's body had been refrigerated for 2 days.
That is correct. But remember, Investigator Knapp also said the body was cold at the time of his investigation.
Cold is a relative term, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And did he take her temperature?
Did not.
So,
Yeah. Exactly.
we don't have the information from which you could try to make a calculation.
Correct.
Is that right?
That is correct.
He also found blood splatter on the wall.
I don't recall that, but okay, I will take that.
I'm not asking you to speculate, but if it is in the autopsy report and the investigator's report that there appears to be slight blood splatter on the wall to the left of the body,
All right.
I don't think it's
Possible.
hearsay, Your Honor. It's a record that's, I believe, has been admitted.
Hold on. All about. Investigator's report. Is it, so, Mr. Balian, it's described as a, as a official record exception? Why not?
Hearsay within hearsay, it's not anything he's relying on informing any business.
Say that again slowly.
Hearsay within hearsay, or hearsay within a business record, he's not relied on it.
Okay,
May I respond?
yes.
And I need to ask a question to respond. You did review the investigator's report and all of the file, including the autopsy report that was done on Susan Berman, did you?
I did.
You're saying that you just don't remember that part,
Correct.
but you did rely on everything that you read.
Absolutely.
All right.
We'll withdraw.
You may proceed, Mr. DeGuerin.
But may I show him the document to refresh his recollection?
Sure. You may refresh his recollection. You don't recall.
I don't recall.
Would it refresh your recollection to see the document? Yes, you may show it to him.
Your Honor, I've got my own notes on it. I don't know that I should put my own notes on the screen. I can.
No,
hand
no,
it to
no,
you.
no. Come up and
Yeah.
come up and show it to him. You may pass it to him. Hold your heart. Just
Where specifically?
Ignore my hand scratch. Let's see.
Here.
Yeah.
Yes, I see that.
Okay. You made other observations? The neighbors reported the dogs running free. The time being on the 23rd at 1100 hours.
Correct.
And then on the 24th is when the actual report to the police was made.
Correct.
So December 23rd at 1100 hours, that would be 11 o'clock in the morning on December the 23rd,
Correct.
when her dogs were seen running free.
Yes.
But the report was made on December 24th at about 13:30 hours, meaning 1:30 in the afternoon.
Correct.
Okay. Putting those reports together, as I assume that you do, in trying to determine time of death, can you tell us what your opinion is, reviewing these records, as the time of death.
Yes, I can.
All right, what is it?
And so my opinion is, yes, there were reportedly, her dogs were running free 11 o'clock the day before she was found. It is my supposition that the postmortem interval, when was she shot, again, between 18 and 36 hours, would put us pretty much the entire day previously. That includes the morning of and the afternoon of. Would I place a lot of emphasis on the dogs running free? I do not. I am not a cop. I'm not a crime scene reconstructionist. I can only go based on the autopsy findings and what I have in hand. And again, that's pretty much the entire day of the 23rd.
Okay, so anytime during the day of the 23rd.
Pretty much, yes. From the very wee hours in the morning to the late hours at night.
And the investigator also said that she appeared to have been dead for more than 24 hours.
Exactly, yes.
You agree with that?
I do indeed.
And that was based on livor mortis not being observed, rigor mortis was not present, and algor mortis was not recorded.
Correct.
Okay. There's a report that gunshot residue was found on both of her hands.
That is correct.
What is the significance of that?
None. There is no significance. Gunshot residue is the materials not actually in the gunpowder, but in the primer. That's actually the little button on the back of the cartridge that starts the ignition of the gunpowder. And that primer material is made up of heavy metals that can be detected on an electron microscope. And that's when we can say someone has been exposed to gunshot residue. Unfortunately, as in all the things we've discussed, that gunshot residue is expelled in a huge cloud. All that tells us is that she was in the vicinity of a gunshot when it was fired. And obviously when she was shot in the back of the head, it's not surprising that she has positive GSR, as we call it, to her hands.
If I'm understanding what you're saying, if she were in the same room as the room where the gun went off, she could have gunshot residue on her hands and you not be surprised by that.
That is a strong possibility. That is correct.
Okay. Now, I believe you said that there was a bullet path through the brain. That's a little differently than the way the original medical examiner said it, isn't it?
Pretty much the same words. I mean, I simplified it, if you will. Obviously, if it's going from here to the front, it's going through the brain.
Sure, it went from rear to front, but because the bullet fragmented and you couldn't find any, or not you, but the autopsy person couldn't find anything except fragments of the bullet, she couldn't actually describe a clear path through the brain.
Correct.
Now, does that mean that the bullet exploded once it passed through the bone?
We don't use the word exploded because that implies that there's some explosive compound in the bullet itself. It fragments. And why did it fragment? Because the skull in the back is pretty thick. And so very commonly bullets will fragment when they are passing through very, very large bones, which is what the case we have here.
Okay. The next question I have to you is about her position when she was shot. It's difficult to determine beyond doubt exactly how she was positioned when the bullet hit her, isn't it?
Absolutely.
People's bodies can move and do move, and you can be bending over or looking down or looking up, and that all affects the way that the bullet passes through the body, doesn't it?
No, not really. I mean, the bullet's going to pass through the body regardless. It's a question of positioning, of the decedent's position in relation to the gun. In other words, our counsel's correct. Can the head be down? Can the head be to the side? Absolutely.
And that better put, I'll clarify my question a little bit. The better way to put it for me to ask you is the positioning of the body, the head, can affect where you assume the gun was.
Well, no, again. So the gun's got to be behind her, right?
Yes.
Again, common sense. Gun's got to be back here. But the question is, could be the gun angled downward, upward, to the side? If you get my drift, that's the difference.
Okay. Now, the investigator also said there was some pieces of newspapers and Kleenex with apparent animal waste found near the body.
That is correct.
Meaning, of course, she had dogs, and apparently there was an effort to clean up the dog pooping inside.
I don't know if that's actually true, but that's a possibility, sure.
And I believe you've testified before, and I think you did today, that there's a possibility that she was on her knees at the time she was shot.
That is a possibility, sure.
Is this consistent with the evidence that she was on her knees and cleaning up the dog mess at the time she was shot?
That is a possibility, certainly.
And certainly, because of the way the bullet entered her head from the back, she did not see it coming.
That would be my supposition. That would be my theory, correct.
And it's just as reasonable that she didn't know that there was someone that was about to shoot her.
That is a possibility, sure.
I think the hypothetical that Mr. Balian put to you, is it consistent that there was someone that she knew was behind her? It's also just as consistent that she didn't know anybody was behind her, correct?
Absolutely.
Question potentially brings in other issues.
Yeah, I don't think that was the way Mr. Balian phrased his question, so why don't you rephrase it to pure hypothetical, with that regard to the identity of the person, which has no bearing on his opinion.
If that was the question, that's the way I recall it, you did not mean to say that you had an opinion that she knew who was behind her.
That is correct.
And if that's the impression that was left, you want to clear that up. That wasn't your opinion, isn't your opinion.
Correct.
And because I speak with everybody tells me, speak with a Texas accent, when I said isn't, that means it is not your opinion, right?
That is correct. It is not
Okay,
my
thanks.
opinion.
I believe that's all, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. DeGuerin. Mr. Balian, redirect examination.
Very brief.
Okay, you may take the lectern, unless you need to be there. All right, make them loud so the jurors can hear these questions.
Yes.
I'm sure they're important enough to be heard.
We'll see. When you said anytime that day from the wee hours of the morning, based on your testimony earlier, you said it's 18 to 36 hours or longer, is that right?
Or longer, correct. So maybe I misspoke. Even further beyond in time. So supposedly there may have been someone even earlier than that who had seen her alive within that time range.
Okay, so it could be any time after that.
Correct.
The person saw them or alive.
Correct.
Okay. And I just got a little confused at the end there. You're saying that the evidence is consistent with her being unaware that she was about to be shot, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. DeGuerin,
No, thank you.
may this witness be excused.
No problem.
Yes, thanks.
You're excused, doctor.
That
Thank-
approach with Mr. DeGuerin off the record, just very briefly.
If it's very, very brief.
It is a scheduling issue.
Oh, do we need this?
You're excused, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So, while the next witness comes down, I wanted to chat with you about
You're muted.
just about transportation here. So I talked with our court director of jury services, and he reminded me that if you waive your mileage reimbursement, you can have a MetroLink pass or an MTA bus card. I will also have the routes made available from wherever you are. I could supply that to you. Also, I want you to know that carpooling and ride sharing is possible. It's good for the environment, saves you money. When you're carpooling or ride sharing, of course, you must not discuss the case or any of the people in it, but there's a lot of things in this world to talk about after, rather than continuing to talk about these matters. So I trust you wouldn't be too uncomfortable to carpool or ride share. You could have a change of pace from this at the end of the day or beginning of the day. In particular, one of our jurors needs a ride to Culver City at the end of the day. And going to Culver City, if you are already going to Culver City or passing through or nearby Culver City, and would be willing to give a fellow juror a ride, that is at the end of the day, not the beginning. Just let Robin know. If you can't or it doesn't make sense for you, that's fine too. But if that could work for you, that'd be great. We'd appreciate knowing. So that's all.
You're unmuted.
So Mr. Lewin, another member of the prosecution team.
Yes, Your Honor. Deputy District Attorney Lisa Russell.
Ms. Russell.
Good morning, Your Honor. Deputy District Attorney Russell for the people.
Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, thanks.
And Mr. Lewis will be handling the cross-examination of the next witness. And you may call your next witness, Ms. Russell.
Thank you, Your Honor. People would like to call Alicia Landman-Reiner to the stand.
Please come stand to the witness stand. Please raise your right hand. You solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please be seated. Pull your chair closer to the mic, please.
And with the mask, you'll need to speak right right into this mic. The other one will pick you up easily, but you'll be audible if you speak right very close into that microphone.
Okay. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Alicia, A-L-I-C-I-A, Landman Reiner with hyphenated. L-A-N as in Nancy, D, M as in Michael, A-N. Hyphen Reiner, R-E-I-N-E-R.
Can you hear the witness in the back? They cannot. Is this microphone, will you tap that microphone? I do think it's on. Will you try to raise your voice? You're soft-spoken, but if you'll raise your voice and speak right into that microphone. We just disinfected it, don't worry.
Sure,
Okay.
no.
Very good.
Is that better?
Mr. Lewin, you'll assist? Or Mr. Milius, our expert on all things electronic?
My feelings are hurt.
I asked you first. It's on.
Okay, we good? Okay.
Just make sure you project, like you're speaking out with, pretend there's no microphone and speak to the crowd.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sounds
Is that good?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Much better, thank you.
All right, good morning. Thank you for being here. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. I'm a little nervous, but maybe we'll get through this together here. I'm going to ask you some questions, and before I begin, I want to make sure if there's anything that you don't understand, just stop me and clarify so that I, make sure that I'm asking you clearly and you're not confused. Sometimes we have a habit of doing that as attorneys. So, what do you do for a living?
I'm trained as a family doctor. I'm partly retired, largely retired now.
And prior to being retired, though, you were a doctor.
Family physician, yes, MD.
Where did you go to medical school?
Albert Einstein College of Medicine
That's in the Bronx in New York.
in Bronx, New York.
What years did you attend Albert Einstein College of Medicine?
Started in the summer of 1978 and graduated in 82, June of 82.
How about for undergrad, where did you go to college?
I went to Harvard.
Impressive.
Thank you.
Did you know Kathleen or Kathie Durst?
Yes, I did. I knew Kathie Durst.
How did you know her?
We were classmates. We were in the same year. And in especially the first year or year and a half, the whole class had classes all day in the same, well, a lot of classes in the same, all as a big group. So we were all in the same room day after day after day, learning.
And it was just the first year that you had classes with her? Or?
It went into the second year, and then partway through the second year, we went into the hospital, and then would rotate through different services. So we weren't all together at that time. And then in the fourth year, there was a period in which the whole class came back for further class work, back from hospital rotations.
Do you know what Kathie did before going to medical school?
She mentioned having been a nurse.
You spoke to her about that?
Yes. She told a little story that she had, she and some fellow nursing students, I believe. It was when she was a student, had organized themselves together to protest the little white hats that they were required to wear at that time because they felt it was old-fashioned and not necessary and for various reasons. So she told that little story.
Did you know that Kathie was married?
Yes.
What did you know about her husband?
When I first started school, nothing, and then at some point I heard that she was married to someone who was part of a large real estate family in New York, one of the real estate families in New York.
Had you ever met her husband?
No.
Did you know who she was married to?
More specifically than what I just said, I didn't.
Okay. At any point in your interactions with Kathie, did you ever see Kathie with any injuries?
Yes, there was one time she came to class, and I noticed that she had something that looked like an injury, reddish, didn't look normal, in her face and neck area. We sat close together often, so she would often come in and sit right in the front row, and I would sit near her, so or sit next to her. So.
And you described it as a reddish area on her neck. Any other description further that you recall?
No, I can't recall more specifically.
Did you have any concerns when you saw that?
Yes, I did. It wasn't typical of a. It didn't look typical of a fall or some kind of unintentional injury like that. Which would, yeah.
Did you believe someone had did this to her?
I thought someone had.
In the time that you spent with Kathie at medical school, did she seem excited about becoming a doctor?
Yes, she certainly did.
And why?
Well, she was serious. She would come in every day on time and nicely put together, well put together, and she had her notebooks and her pens ready and would sit right in the front row, kind of front and sometimes center, and we had shared notes on occasion. Her notes were good. I mean, she was serious, she seemed dedicated, and she seemed excited to have the opportunity, to train to be a doctor.
Did you know about her having any issues at school that you knew of with respect to her studies or any rotations?
I did not know of anything like that.
I want to direct your attention to talking more about the nature or the environment of medical school back in 1982. Back then, were there as many women in medicine as there are today?
No, there were not. In my years, we were on the cusp of being normalized as part of medical training. So in my class, there was something like a third of us were women, which was a goodly number. But then once you got into the hospital and you were on the wards, it was much more unusual to have women in higher positions. There were some women residents, but far fewer women finished doctors and in authority. So it was on the edge there.
So it's kind of a big deal for a woman to have been even going to medical school.
It was a big deal. It was a very big deal.
Would becoming a doctor after having been a nurse been a big transition back then?
Yes, it would be a transition. There were ways in which it would be easier, would have been easier, for someone with nursing training to make that transition, particularly in clinical work, once you got into the hospital, because you knew something about patient care. Those of us who went to college and then went to medical school, got on the wards, we were fairly clueless at first. But a nurse would know how things went, know how to look at a patient, assess a patient, would know a great deal that the rest of us who didn't have that background didn't know. So that would be quite an advantage, but it would also be a real step up in status in a system that was where were real status differences. So that might be more of a challenge, or it might be exciting.
Did Kathie appear to be proud of the fact that she was about to graduate to become a doctor?
I never spoke to her specifically about that.
Okay. Now, going rotations at medical school. Without getting too much into the history of them, but we know what they are. What years did you guys do rotations when you were in medical school?
The second and third years. And toward the end of the fourth year. Second and third years were the main rotations, and then in the fourth year you had some rotations, and then we broke for classes, and then you had some again at the end.
I see. Did you ever miss or call in sick to rotation?
I did. In my third or maybe into my fourth year, I got chicken pox. And when you get chicken pox as an adult, you're pretty sick. But also, unfortunately, I'd been working in the neonatal ICU, intensive care unit, so that's where the premature babies are and sick babies are being cared for. And we never figured out why, where I got chicken pox. But so I woke up with a high fever and feeling very ill, and then I found I had a rash, and I believed it was varicella chickenpox, so I called in to the rotation. I was doing the pediatric rotation in Bronx Lebanon Hospital, and told them that I thought I had chickenpox and shouldn't come in.
So that was going to be my next question. Who did you call to? So you called the actual place that you had to do your rotation at to inform them you would not be coming in?
Yes, at the time it was basically a month in one service, meaning like pediatrics or adult medicine or obstetrics or one of those, something like that, surgery, in one hospital for a month.
Did you call the dean of the medical school to tell him that you would not be
No, certainly not.
rotation?
No.
Now, you called in sick to rotation for chicken pox. Generally, how sick would one have to be to call in sick to rotation?
Quite sick. I mean, basically, if you could possibly stand up and get there, you would, because it was the culture of medicine and medical training. And also, we were very much proving ourselves, especially once we got into the clinical arena. It was very common that we'd want to prove ourselves to be as tough or tougher than the men. And so the culture was that you hung in there until you fell over, basically. So you wouldn't call in unless you were really sick, or in the situation I gave you, you had something contagious that would be dangerous to the patients or your fellow doctors.
You even said it here yourself, especially as a woman, there was even more pressure to make sure you didn't call in sick to rotation?
Yeah, I think we felt we were all constantly proving ourselves. And so, like in the Marines, I mean, you just don't, the culture was that you didn't show, any undue weakness. You showed strength. Sometimes in our own way, but that you were very, it was a culture to be very conservative about calling in sick.
I want to talk to you now about who a medical student would call if they were too sick to go to rotation. If you were going to call in sick, who would you call?
You would call, if you could, someone on your team. So within that usually month-long rotation, say in pediatrics or surgery, you worked with a clinical team. You're part of a patient care team a lot of the time, and then you'd contact somebody on that team, like the resident on that team would be your immediate supervisor. Or if you couldn't reach them, you could call the department in that hospital and try to reach the attending physician, the senior physician who was in charge of the rotation in that hospital that month.
prior to knowing your assignment or your rotation, you had all details regarding your assignment. You knew where you were to be, who to report to, et cetera. There was never any ambiguity about where you would need to go, or?
Well, you certainly knew what hospital and what service you were going to. And you ought to know, to whom you should report. Conceivably, you might not know to whom you should report, but you knew for months ahead usually what department and service that you were going, because you chose your electives, your rotations rather, and electives well ahead.
This may be a good time for us to take our afternoon break until 1:30 p.m. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll return at 1:30. Do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until after you've discussed the case with the other jurors during deliberations. And of course, as always, no tweeting, no Facebook, no social media. See you at 1:30. You do not discuss your testimony with any witness. We'll see you at 1:30.